Top 3 Deadliest Native American Tribes in History. In the long and brutal history of the American frontier, certain names stand out, not because they were whispered around campfires, but because they were spoken with a kind of solemn respect, or outright fear. Among the countless tribes that once moved across this land like wind over grass, 3 in particular earned a reputation that echoes even now. And today, we begin with one that brought an iron grip to the southern plains, the Comanche. You've heard of fierce warriors. But the Comanche weren't just fierce, they were relentless. Calculated. And they didn't just fight for survival. They dominated. Now, let's roll back the clock. The Comanche weren't always the lords of the plains. Originally, they were part of the Shoshone people, living up in the rugged terrain of the Great Basin, what's now parts of Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. It was tough country, where food was scarce and life was harder still. Then something changed. When the Spanish arrived on this continent in the 1500s, they unknowingly altered the power dynamics of the entire American West. They brought horses. And it didn't take long for those horses to make their way north, through trade, theft, or war, into the hands of native tribes. Among those who acquired them, none took to the saddle like the Comanche. They didn't just learn to ride, they redefined it. The horse turned them from foot-bound hunters into mounted warriors. It transformed their way of life, their reach, and their reputation. They moved fast, first out of the mountains, then onto the wide-open plains of what's now Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. The buffalo were plenty there, and with horses, the Comanche could hunt better, move farther, and strike harder than any of their neighbors. In time, they carved out a range that few dared to enter. And make no mistake, their mastery of horses wasn't just about mobility. It was about power. Comanche boys were taught to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Girls too. Horses were wealth. Horses were status. And when a Comanche warrior went to battle, he did so with a horse he knew as well as his own brother. William Blakemore, an Englishman who spent years among them, once said the Comanche on foot were clumsy. But on horseback? Graceful doesn't do it justice, they became something almost untouchable. Capturing wild horses became a skill nearly as revered as warfare itself. They had a method: throw a loop around the neck, wear the beast down, then revive it gently by breathing into its nostrils. From there, the horse was paired with a calm mare, trained, and eased into human presence until it could be ridden. It wasn't just training, it was a ritual. And it worked. With this horsepower, literal and cultural, the Comanche reshaped the land. Their raids became legendary. Settlers and soldiers alike feared the sound of hoofbeats in the night. Even the term, Comanche moon, came to describe those full moon nights when they would strike Mexican settlements, vanishing before morning with horses, captives, and blood on the ground. They weren't interested in treaties. They weren't looking for coexistence. The Comanche operated by an older code, one rooted in pride, honor, and an unshakable belief in their right to roam free. When Spain claimed Louisiana from France, they quickly learned that maps meant little on the plains. Spanish officials wrote home about these mounted warriors who could ride like ghosts and hit like thunder. General James Wilkinson, a U.S. officer, famously called them the toughest indigenous people on the continent. They didn't just resist conquest, they stalled it. For nearly half a century, the Spanish failed to gain meaningful ground in Comanche territory. They weren't the only ones. Mexican settlers, American pioneers, even hardened frontiersmen, all had stories of Comanche raids that left entire homesteads burned and families shattered. There was a method to the madness. In Comanche culture, young men proved themselves through raids. It wasn't about senseless violence, it was about survival, status, and honor. A successful raid could earn a warrior respect, wealth, and position within the tribe. This wasn't savagery. It was their version of the American dream: rise through merit, through action. That said, it would be dishonest to paint them in romantic tones. The Comanche were feared not only for their skill in battle, but for their brutal treatment of enemies. Accounts tell of captives, men, women, and children, subjected to tortures that, by any standard, were gruesome. Eyes burned in the sun, lips sewn shut, scalping, and worse. Women, too, were not spared from these customs. In fact, Comanche women were often just as fierce, and in some cases, even more feared, than the men. Take for example the notorious raids across northern Mexico. Hundreds of mounted warriors would descend on towns, often in the dead of night. Entire villages were massacred. Women were taken as slaves or worse. Horses were rounded up and driven north by the dozens. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic, relentless, and devastating. Even in the young Republic of Texas, settlers struggled to secure their borders. In 1836, a tragic episode unfolded at Fort Parker, when Comanche warriors approached under the pretense of peace. Benjamin Parker stepped outside to parley. He was promptly surrounded and killed, speared repeatedly in front of his kin. The rest stormed the gate. What followed was one of the bloodiest episodes in frontier memory: men butchered, women captured, and survivors left haunted. Among the captives taken that day was a young girl named Cynthia Ann Parker. She would grow up within the tribe, marry a Comanche war chief, and give birth to Quanah Parker, arguably the most famous Comanche of them all. But that's a story for another day. The truth is, to many who faced them, the Comanche were more than a tribe. They were a force of nature. Hard to understand. Impossible to ignore. And that's why they belong at the top of any list of fearsome Native American tribes. Not because of cruelty. Not even because of their battle tactics. But because they shaped the fate of nations. Spanish, Mexican, Texan, and American governments all tried, at different times and in different ways, to tame or ally with the Comanche. None succeeded for long. According to S.C. Gwynne, author of Empire of the Summer Moon, no other native tribe in this region matched their ability to inflict damage. His words, "There isn't even a close second." And when you read the first-hand accounts, from Spanish priests to U.S. generals, it's hard to argue otherwise. But perhaps what's most striking is this: for all their violence, the Comanche were not mindless. They were living within the codes of their world, one where survival demanded ruthlessness, and where the weak were swallowed up. They understood power, territory, and loyalty. They understood war. And they made sure everyone else did too. If you found this look at the Comanche compelling, don't forget to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Next, we'll head deeper into the heart of native resistance, where another tribe earned its own fearsome legacy. Long before the birth of the United States, there was already a powerful union operating in the heart of the Northeast. Not a European government or a colonial outpost, but an indigenous alliance, forged in fire, blood, and diplomacy, that commanded both respect and fear. This was the Haudenosaunee, known by many today as the Iroquois Confederacy. But their name, like much else about them, comes with a story of its own. The label, Iroquois, didn't come from within. It was a name given by old enemies, the Algonquins, who called them rattlesnakes. Not out of admiration, but out of dread. And in a way, the name fit. The Iroquois didn't lumber into battle. They struck with speed, precision, and deadly consequence. When they came, you didn't see them until it was too late. This confederacy brought together 6 distinct nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later, the Tuscarora. Each tribe had its own lands, its own customs, and its own voice. But under the great law of peace, they forged a system of cooperation that was ahead of its time. Their territory stretched across modern-day New York, pushing west and south as far as Tennessee, and at one point, their influence reached all the way into parts of Michigan and Illinois. The Mohawk sat to the east and served as the keepers of the eastern door. They were the first line in matters of diplomacy and warfare with the European settlers. The Oneida and Onondaga held the center, acting as a spine to the Union. The Cayuga and Seneca lay further west, forming a natural buffer and expanding the Confederacy's reach. Each brought something different to the table, but they moved together with remarkable unity. This was not a passive coalition. The Iroquois were warriors, make no mistake. From a young age, their boys were trained with bow, spear, and club, not in theory, but in real conflict. Raiding wasn't just a way of life, it was a rite of passage. And the targets were often other tribes, sometimes even colonial settlements. By the time a young man came of age, he'd already tasted the smoke of battle. Victory meant more than spoils. It was the path to leadership. Those who distinguished themselves in war could rise through the ranks, eventually becoming war chiefs, leaders of men not just by birth, but by earned reputation. But their warfare had a dark side, as warfare usually does. Captives weren't simply taken. Some were adopted into Iroquois society, others weren't so lucky. One brutal tradition was running the gauntlet, where prisoners were forced to sprint between two lines of warriors, each armed with thorny switches and clubs. Few made it through unscathed. It was as much psychological as physical, a test, a punishment, and a message to others. The 1600s brought the Beaver Wars, a bloody, decades-long campaign in which the Iroquois sought to control more land and hunting territory, especially with the fur trade booming. They turned their sights on other powerful groups like the Huron and the Susquehannocks, driving many to ruin. Their grip on the region tightened with each campaign, and by the early 1700s, their domain covered an immense swath of North America. Yet what truly set the Haudenosaunee apart wasn't just their military edge, it was their ability to hold together. 6 different nations, with their own views, disputes, and ambitions, yet they managed to govern themselves through councils and shared law. Decisions were made through consensus, not conquest. And when bigger powers clashed, like in the French and Indian War, the Iroquois moved as one, throwing their support behind the British. There's a line from scripture that seems to sum it up well: though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. The Iroquois lived that wisdom long before it was quoted in English. They proved that strength wasn't just in numbers, it was in unity. And when a people move with purpose and speak with one voice, they become something far more than the sum of their parts. They weren't just warriors. The Apache were survivors of the highest order, carved out of the tough landscape of the American Southwest, and shaped by centuries of pressure from all sides. While most tribes were pushed, broken, or absorbed, the Apache adapted, and endured. Their roots trace back to the Athabascan-speaking peoples, whose distant relatives lived as far north as Alaska and western Canada. But the Apache themselves made their stand in rough country, from the Arkansas River deep into northern Mexico, across Texas and Arizona. They didn't settle where life was easy, they lived where others couldn't follow. What made them stand apart wasn't just their toughness, it was their mobility, their instincts, and their gift for staying one step ahead. Faced with larger enemies, from Spanish troops to Comanche horsemen to the relentless push of the American frontier, the Apache held their ground through cunning rather than brute force. They didn't build walls. They became the land. Fast, silent, and invisible until they chose otherwise. Their style of warfare was all about movement. Think hit and run, not hold the line. And when they came, they struck with terrifying speed. Mounted or on foot, they could vanish into the terrain before their enemies even realized what had happened. They learned quickly, adopting Spanish horses and European weapons, folding them into their old ways without losing what made them Apache. They were expert riders, capable of loosing arrows mid-gallop with such speed and precision that it seemed almost unreal. 7 arrows could be in the air before the first one struck. Even General George Crook, no stranger to hard men, called them the tigers of the human species. And that wasn't just for show. These men could outrun cavalry patrols, cross mountain passes barefoot, and fight with a ferocity that left seasoned soldiers shaken. Their raids weren't reckless, they were calculated. Targets were chosen with care. Timing was everything. They struck, they took what they came for, and they disappeared, fast, clean, and ruthless. And yes, they could be brutal, particularly to their enemies. This was a time when cruelty was currency, and the Apache didn't spend it lightly. But when they did, it sent a message, one that left deep scars across the frontier. To this day, the name Apache echoes with a certain weight. Among the many tribes of North America, they stood, and still stand, as a symbol of resistance, strategy, and raw will to survive. If this kind of history speaks to you, we'd like to hear your take in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing, we're just getting started.